I never imagined that two siblings could destroy each other in a courtroom until the day I witnessed how every word they spoke turned a custody case into a family nightmare that would change their lives forever. I am Judge Latasha Brown, 45 years old, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I have been in this job for over 15 years and have seen it all. Violent divorces, inheritance disputes, broken families, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened that Tuesday in October when Marcus and Diane Thompson entered my courtroom. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from so I can see how far it has reached. The case seemed simple on paper. Marcus, 38, and Diane, 35, were fighting for custody of Diane's 3 children. Yes, you heard that right. They were not their mutual children. They were Diane's children with her ex-husband, but Marcus, her younger brother, wanted to take them away from her. Something did not add. Up there, right? Marcus arrived with his lawyer, impeccable suit, organized documents. Diane came in alone, with red eyes, wrinkled clothes. The difference was brutal. Marcus's lawyer started strong, alleging severe neglect, substance abuse, and an unsuitable environment for the minors. Blurry photos of Diane's house, reports from concerned teachers, witness statements from neighbors. Everything painted a grim picture for her. Diane denied nothing at first. She admitted she had gone through difficult times after the divorce. Yes, she had drunk more than she should some nights, that the house was messy. But she insisted that she loved her children, that she was getting better, that Marcus was exaggerating everything. I was taking notes, processing the information, when Diane dropped the first bombshell. Your Honor, my brother is not doing this out of love for my children. He is doing it because he wants to get revenge on me for telling the truth to our mother before she died. The courtroom went silent. Marcus's lawyer stiffened. Marcus clenched his jaw. I gave her permission to continue. Diane took a deep breath and said that 3 years ago, just before their mother died of cancer, she had confessed something to her that Marcus had been hiding for years. Marcus had forged their mother's signature to sell a family property and keep the money, almost $200,000 that should have been shared between the two siblings. Marcus exploded. He stood up shouting that it was a lie, that Diane was a manipulative alcoholic making up stories. I had to bang the gavel 3 times to restore order. I warned that if he interrupted like that again, he would be removed from the courtroom. But Diane wasn't done. She said she had proof. She pulled out some crumpled papers from her bag, copies of bank documents, transfer records. I reviewed them. Indeed, they showed suspicious movements on Marcus's accounts right after the property sale. Now the case had completely changed. It was no longer just about custody. It was about money, family, betrayal, revenge. Marcus wasn't seeking to protect those children. He was trying to punish his sister for exposing him. I asked Marcus directly if the accusations were true. His lawyer tried to stop him, but Marcus was so angry he spoke anyway. He admitted that yes, he had sold the property, but he did it because their mother was ill and they needed to pay for treatments. That Diane never helped financially. That he had sacrificed himself. Diane shouted that was false, that she had been there every day caring for their mother while Marcus barely visited, that the money was never used for treatments, that Marcus spent it on a failed business. And then Marcus dropped his own bombshell. Want to talk about sacrifices, Diane? Let's talk about why your husband really left you. Let's talk about who he found you with. My blood ran cold. Diane went pale. I ordered Marcus to explain himself or be permanently silent. Marcus said Diane's husband left her because he caught her cheating, not with a stranger, with the husband's best friend. And that man kept showing up at the house where the children lived. The minors had seen him stay overnight multiple times. Diane denied everything through tears. She said yes, she made a mistake, one night of weakness after years of a difficult marriage, but she had ended it over a year ago. That man had only been to the house twice since then to return things. But Marcus didn't stop. He pulled out his phone and showed screenshots, text messages between Diane and that man from only 3 weeks earlier. Messages clearly suggesting an ongoing relationship. The lawyers didn't know where to hide. This had stopped being a standard legal case and had become a full-on war between siblings, where each sought to destroy the other regardless of collateral damage. I ordered a 30-minute recess. I needed to think. needed to separate myself from the emotions and analyze the facts coldly. The law was clear on several points. First, custody must always be decided based on the best interest of the minors, not adult revenge. Second, Diane's infidelity was irrelevant to her ability as a mother unless it directly affected the children. Third, Marcus's financial fraud, though serious, was not directly relevant to this specific custody case, though it could lead to separate charges. But what did matter was the emotional stability of both, their real motivations, and the environment each could offer those 3 children. I called the session back to order. I asked for the social services who had evaluated both homes. Their report was revealing. Diane's house was neglected, but not unlivable. The children were clean, fed, attending school. Diane worked full-time as a nurse, irregular but stable hours. She had debts but was paying them. Marcus's house was immaculate. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. Good income as a sales manager. No records. But also no experience raising children. And when the children were asked, none expressed a desire to live with their uncle. They didn't even know him well. That changed everything for me. The children were not pawns in a revenge game between siblings. They were people with their own voices, even if small. I ordered individual interviews with each child in the presence of a psychologist. All 3, aged 7, 9, and 11, said the same. Mom had bad days but loved them. Uncle Marcus rarely visited before. They didn't understand why all of a sudden he wanted them to live with him. The truth became crystal clear. Marcus wasn't seeking the well-being of those children. He was looking for the cruelest way to hurt his sister. And Diane, though imperfect, was fighting for her children for real. But I also couldn't ignore the red flags. The disorder, the alcohol, the emotional instability. Diane needed help, not punishment. On sentencing day, the courtroom was completely silent. Marcus looked at me confident in his victory. Diane was trembling. I read my decision. Custody would remain with Diane, but with strict conditions. She had to attend individual and family therapy for at least 6 months. Random substance tests for 1 year. Monthly supervised visits by social services. And Marcus would have the right to regular supervised visits if the children wished, which could be suspended if they requested it. Additionally, I ordered a formal investigation into the sale of the family property. If fraud was confirmed, Marcus would face separate legal consequences. Marcus erupted. He yelled it was unfair that I was protecting a neglectful mother. I had him removed from the courtroom. Diane cried, but this time out of relief. She came up to me and thanked me through sobs. I told her not to thank me, to thank her children for loving her despite everything, and to use this second chance to be the mother they needed. 6 months later, I received a follow-up report. Diane had completed the therapy program. She had stopped drinking entirely. The house was tidy. The children showed improvement in school and emotional stability. Marcus had been investigated and faced civil charges for fraud, but had chosen not to appeal the custody ruling. The siblings did not speak. Probably never would again. This case taught me that justice is not always about punishing the guilty or rewarding the innocent. Sometimes it's about protecting those who have no voice amid the chaos adults create. Those 3 children did not ask for an imperfect mother or a vengeful uncle. They just wanted to grow up with someone who truly loved them. And although my ruling may have definitively destroyed the relationship between Marcus and Diane, it saved the relationship between a mother and her children. That was the victory that mattered. I remember perfectly that November morning when I first reviewed the file for the Harris case. It was a dispute over inheritance, something I sadly see all too often in my courtroom. 2 brothers, Marcus and Darnell Harris, fighting over the property of their late mother. Cases like these usually get resolved through settlements, mediations, maybe a couple of tense but manageable hearings. I never imagined this would become the most heartbreaking experience of my career. The first hearing was relatively normal. Marcus, the elder brother, 42 years old, arrived with his lawyer, a weary-looking man who had clearly handled too many family cases. Darnell, 3 years younger, came alone, insisting he didn't need legal representation because the truth speaks for itself. That phrase should have alerted me. In 20 years as a judge, I've learned that when someone invokes the truth so vehemently, they're usually about to unleash something uncontrollable. The property in question was a modest house on the east side of Detroit, the very house where both brothers had grown up. Their mother, Mrs. Evelyn Harris, had passed away 6 months prior, leaving a will that apparently named Marcus as the sole heir. Darnell was contesting that will, claiming that his mother was not of sound mind when she signed it, and that Marcus had exercised undue influence over her during her final months. What started as predictable arguments soon took an unexpected turn. Marcus presented medical documentation showing his mother was lucid until the end. He had psychological evaluations, notes from her primary care physician, even video recordings where Evelyn clearly stated her wishes. Everything seemed quite conclusive. But then Darnell stood up, his hands trembling slightly, and said something that froze the room. "Your Honor, there is something this court needs to know about why my mother truly changed that will." Marcus's lawyer tried to object, but I raised my hand. Something in Darnell's voice, a mix of pain and determination, made me give him room to speak. What came next completely altered the case. Darnell revealed that Marcus had been siphoning money from their mother's bank accounts during the last 2 years of her life. They were not huge amounts, he explained, but small and steady withdrawals totaling about $30,000. Marcus had convinced their mother that the money was for her medication and care, but in reality, he used it to cover his own gambling debts. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "That is an absolute lie," he shouted, pointing at his brother. "How dare you make something like that up?" But Darnell was not finished. With a broken voice, he continued explaining that their mother discovered the theft just weeks before she died, and instead of reporting Marcus, she decided to leave everything in the hands of the law by ensuring the house, her only remaining real asset, was protected so Marcus could not sell it to continue gambling. I ordered a recess. I needed time to process what I had just heard. As I left the courtroom, I could see the looks exchanged between the brothers. Decades of family history collapsing in a single moment. It wasn't just money at stake here. It was betrayal, pain, the disintegration of what was once a family. When we resumed, I gave Marcus the opportunity to respond, and this is where the case took another twist no one anticipated. Marcus, with tears running down his face, admitted that yes, he had taken money. But then he countered with an equally devastating revelation. "I took that money because I had no other choice," he said, his voice trembling. "Darnell never showed up, not once in 2 years while I cared for Mom day and night. I quit my job, lost my house, my wife left me because all my time was for Mom. And where were you, brother? Where were you when she called me at 3 in the morning confused and scared? That money I took barely covered a fraction of what I spent out of my own pocket caring for her." Darnell paled. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he ignored it. "I was here too," he replied, raising his voice. "I paid her medical bills that you couldn't cover, $15,000 from my own account when she needed that surgery. You never thanked me, never even acknowledged it." "Because you were never present," Marcus retorted. "Money is not the same as presence. Mom asked about you constantly. Do you have any idea how many times I had to invent excuses for why her youngest son wasn't coming to visit?" I watched them accuse each other, each revealing wounds that had remained hidden for years. Darnell had sent money but stayed distant because he couldn't bear to see his mother deteriorate, the same strong woman who raised him. Marcus had been physically present but resentful, feeling he alone bore the burden of care while his brother lived his life. Each accusation revealed another layer of complexity. Marcus admitted to lying to doctors about their mother's financial status to qualify for certain assistance programs. Darnell confessed he had encouraged their mother to change the will not out of real concern, but out of wounded pride when she initially left everything to Marcus. I requested bank statements, medical records, correspondence between the brothers. The more evidence accumulated, the clearer it became that neither was completely innocent nor wholly guilty. Both had loved their mother in their own imperfect way. Both had made mistakes, and both were using this trial not only to claim property, but to process years of unresolved pain, guilt, and resentment. The question that haunted me every night as I reviewed this case was not simply who had legal right to the house. It was how I could apply the law in a way that served justice without completely destroying what little remained of this family. Because despite all the anger and accusations, I could see that beneath all that pain, these brothers still cared for each other. and that made my decision infinitely harder. I ordered a 1-week recess so both parties could submit additional documentation. What I needed to see was not just legal evidence, but the full picture of what had happened in that family during the last years of Evelyn Harris's life. But what I received was far more than I had anticipated. Marcus's lawyer presented a journal. Not just any journal, but Evelyn's personal journal, found among her belongings after her death. Marcus had hesitated to present it earlier, his lawyer explained, because it contained very painful private reflections. But given the circumstances, he felt he had no other choice. When I began reading those pages that night in my office, I understood why he had hesitated. Evelyn had documented everything. Her nighttime confusion, the fear of becoming a burden, the gratitude toward Marcus for being there, but also the pain of not seeing Darnell. She wrote about conversations with Marcus where he borrowed money, always promising to pay it back. But she also wrote about phone calls with Darnell, long conversations where he sent her money but refused to visit. "My 2 sons love me," she wrote in one entry, "but neither can look me in the eye as I fade away." That line haunted me for days. Here was a dying mother, aware that her sons were dealing with her decline in completely opposite ways, and feeling abandoned by both despite her efforts. The most devastating entry was dated 3 weeks before her death. Evelyn wrote about confronting Marcus about the missing money. He had cried, admitting everything, explaining about debts, desperation. She had forgiven him, she wrote, because, "What else can I do? He is my son." But then she added something that changed my perspective on the whole case. "I will change the will, not to punish him, but to protect him from himself. This house is the only thing that can save him when I am gone." When I presented this finding at the next hearing, Darnell broke down, completely. He collapsed into his chair, sobbing in a way that made several people in the room look away. Marcus, surprisingly, approached him, but Darnell rejected him with a violent wave of his hand. "Don't touch me," he said through tears. "You have no right." But Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he stayed there and then said something no one expected. "You're right. I have no right. But Mom was right about me. I'm a mess. I always have been. And you were always the successful son, the one who got out of Detroit, the one who made something of his life. That's why you couldn't come, right? Because coming back to this house meant admitting where you came from. I could never escape that." The silence that followed was deafening. Darnell slowly looked up, his face marked by tears. "It's not that I didn't want to come," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's that every time I saw her, I saw my own future. Illness, decline, dependence, it terrified me. So I sent money because that was the only thing I could control. Numbers in an account. Easy. Clean. Without having to smell the medication or see her, forget my name. It was the first time the brothers spoke with true honesty, and it was happening in my courtroom, in front of strangers, recorded by a transcriber. Part of me wanted to stop them, suggest they continue this conversation in private. But the other part, the judge who had spent 2 decades navigating the complexities of family conflicts, knew that sometimes the truth needs witnesses to become real. Then Darnell did something that changed everything again. He took an envelope out of his briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. Inside was a certified check for $45,000 made out to Marcus Harris. "It's all the money Mom sent me during her lifetime," he explained. "I always knew you needed it more than I did. I should have given it to you when she was alive. I should have been there. This money doesn't make up for anything, but it's what I can offer." Marcus looked at the check as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked up at his brother and asked, "Why now? Why not 6 months ago? Or a year ago? Or when you really needed it?" "Because," Darnell replied, his voice breaking again, "because I thought I could fix all of this with money, like I always did." But Mom knew the truth. She knew that neither of us was really there for her the way she needed. And now she's dead, and all we have left is blaming each other for not being enough. Marcus's lawyer tried to intervene, probably to advise him on the legal implications of this conversation, but Marcus silenced him with a gesture. "You know what the worst part of all this is?" he asked, looking directly at his brother. "That Mom spent her last days worrying about us, not about herself, but about us. She wrote in that journal how she hoped that after her death, we would find a way to be brothers again. And here we are, fighting over a house she loved, turning it into a battlefield. I had to order another recess. The emotional tension in the room had become unbearable, not just for the brothers, but for everyone present. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen it all in his 20 years of service, discreetly wiped his eyes. When I returned to my office, I sat in the dark for a long time, reflecting on what I had just witnessed. This case had transformed into something much more complex than a simple inheritance dispute. It was an examination of how pain and guilt can distort familial love until it becomes unrecognizable. It was about two men who had loved their mother but had been unable to love each other through their loss. And I, sitting at my desk with the weight of the decision pressing down on my shoulders, had to find a way to apply the cold, objective law to this deeply human and heartbreaking situation. I knew that any decision I made would have repercussions far beyond determining who would get the deed to a house in Detroit. It would define how these brothers would relate to each other, or if they would relate at all, for the rest of their lives. I spent that night rereading every page of Evelyn's diary, every document submitted, every testimony transcribed. But more than that, I found myself thinking about my own siblings, about the silent cracks that exist in all families, about how a father's death can reveal fractures that had been forming under the surface for years. At 3 a.m, while the courthouse building remained empty and silent, I made a decision that I knew would be controversial, perhaps even questioned by my superiors. But it was the only decision my conscience would allow me to make. When I called the final hearing 3 days later, the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus had visibly lost weight in recent weeks, with deep dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Darnell, for his part, had lost that executive composure that had characterized him at the start of the process. Both looked like men who had been stripped of their defenses, exposed in their most vulnerable humanity. I settled into my seat, ordered silence in the room, and began to speak. I told them I had spent 23 years as a judge, that I had presided over hundreds of family cases, some more legally complex than this one, but none that had forced me to face so directly the intersection between legal justice and emotional justice. I explained that the law was clear in many aspects, but there were gray areas where the letter of the law needed to be tempered with human understanding. I could see the lawyers tense up, preparing to argue any decision that did not favor their client, but I asked them for patience, to listen to my full reasoning before responding. First, I addressed the issue of the will. After reviewing all the evidence, including Evelyn's diary and the testimonies of the medical professionals who had treated her, I determined that the will signed 3 weeks before her death was legally valid. Evelyn had been in full possession of her mental faculties at that time. Her doctor had confirmed this, and the diary clearly showed that her decision had been deliberate and reasoned, not the product of confusion or manipulation. Marcus had legal right to the house. I saw Darnell close his eyes, nodding slowly, as if he had been waiting for that verdict. But then I continued speaking, and what I said next took everyone by surprise. I explained that although Marcus had legal right to the property, the circumstances surrounding the $42,000 withdrawn from Evelyn's account constituted a separate matter that needed to be resolved. The fact that Evelyn had personally forgiven him did not eliminate Marcus's legal obligation to answer for those funds, especially considering they had been taken in a way that could be interpreted as exploiting a vulnerable person. I could have ordered a criminal investigation. I could have referred the case to the appropriate authorities, but I did not. Instead, I ordered Marcus to accept the $45,000 check that Darnell had offered, not as a gift, but as an interest-free loan to be paid over 10 years. I established that the monthly payments would be modest, designed to be manageable even with Marcus's limited income, but substantial enough to ensure the commitment would be maintained. More importantly, I stipulated that any missed payments would not result in loss of the house, but would extend the loan term. I wanted to make sure this agreement would not become another source of conflict, but a bridge between the brothers. But there was more, and this part generated the strongest reactions. I ordered that the house remain Marcus's property with an additional condition to be recorded in the deed. If Marcus decided to sell the property at any time within the next 15 years, Darnell would have the right of first refusal at market value, and any profit above the current appraised value would be divided equally between the two brothers. Additionally, I established that a small percentage of any future sale, specifically 5%, would be donated to a local charity working with families affected by dementia in memory of Evelyn Harris. Marcus's lawyer stood immediately, objecting that these conditions went beyond my judicial authority. Technically, he was right. I was extending the limits of what would normally be expected in a probate case. But I reminded him that both parties had agreed to submit to my jurisdiction to resolve this dispute, and my terms represented a complete resolution that avoided years of additional litigation that would only benefit the lawyers. I gave Marcus the option: accept these terms or face the possibility of reopening the investigation into the funds withdrawn from his mother's account. Marcus did not look at his lawyer. Instead, he looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I accept," he said simply. "I accept all the terms." His lawyer seemed ready to argue more, but Marcus was firm. "I accept," he repeated. Darnell also nodded, though I could see tears forming again in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling. This is fair." But I was not finished. There was one last thing I needed to say, something that went beyond my legal obligations, but that I felt was essential. I told both brothers to stand and look at each other directly. It was uncomfortable. I could feel the resistance in the room, but I insisted. When they finally stood face to face, separated only by the courtroom table, I spoke to them not as a judge, but as someone who had seen too many families destroy themselves in these halls. I told them their mother had died worrying about them, not herself. That her last thoughts had been about how her sons would find their way back to each other. I told them no amount of money, no property, no court ruling could replace what they had lost, but that they had a choice about what they would do with what they still had, their relationship as brothers. I reminded them life is fragile, that none of us knows how much time we have left, and that living with resentment is like poisoning oneself, hoping the other will suffer. Marcus was the first to move. He extended his hand toward Darnell, not to shake it but simply holding it there, waiting. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, Darnell just looked at that outstretched hand. Then, slowly, he took it. And in that simple gesture, I saw the beginning of something that no court ruling could have ordered: forgiveness. Watching that moment, I knew my decision had been the right one, not because it was legally perfect, but because it offered two broken men a chance at healing. The days following that handshake were strange for me. I continued with my usual judicial duties, presiding over hearings, reviewing documents, signing orders, but the Harris case stayed with me in a way few cases had. I found myself wondering if Marcus and Darnell would truly manage to rebuild their relationship, or if that moment of reconciliation had been just that, a moment destined to fade as soon as they left my courtroom. About 6 weeks after issuing my sentence, I received an unexpected call from my judicial assistant. She told me a Mr. Marcus Harris was in the lobby requesting to speak with me. My first reaction was immediate concern. In my experience, when someone returns after a sentence has been handed down, it usually means trouble. Maybe Marcus was violating the terms of the agreement. Maybe the brothers had started fighting again. I told my assistant to let him in, mentally preparing myself for bad news. When Marcus entered my office, I was surprised by his appearance. He looked better than the last time I had seen him. He had gained some weight, his eyes no longer had those deep dark circles, and there was something different in his posture, a kind of lightness that hadn't been present during the trial. He carried a manila folder and seemed nervous, but not in the defensive way he had been in court. It was more like the nervousness of someone who has something important to say and isn't sure how to begin. He invited me to sit, which I did quickly, placing the folder on his lap and looking at it as if it contained secrets he struggled to share. I gave him time. I have learned that silence is sometimes the best way to allow people to find their words. Finally, he looked up and said something I didn't expect. He wanted to thank me not only for my sentence, but for having forced them to look each other in the eyes that last day. He told me that moment had been more powerful for him than any court order. But that was not the main reason for his visit. He opened the folder and took out several documents that he carefully placed on my desk. As he arranged them, he began to tell me a story that completely surprised me. It turned out that after the sentence, he and Darnell had started meeting weekly, initially just to have coffee and talk about trivial matters, carefully avoiding painful topics. But gradually, those conversations deepened. They began sharing childhood memories, stories about their mother that they had never told each other, experiences each had kept as private treasures. During one of those talks, About 3 weeks after the trial, Marcus had shown Darnell something he found while cleaning out their mother's attic. It was an old shoebox hidden behind some ancient suitcases, a box containing letters written by their mother over the years, addressed to both brothers but never sent. They were like the diary we had seen in court, but more intimate, more revealing. Marcus pointed to the documents on my desk. They were copies of some of those letters. He asked permission to read one to me, his voice trembling slightly. I nodded, completely absorbed by what he was revealing. The letter he chose was dated 5 years before Evelyn's death, long before her dementia began to manifest. In it, Evelyn wrote about a recurring dream she had, a dream where her 2 sons were on opposite sides of a swollen river, shouting at each other but unable to hear one another over the roar of the water. In the dream, she was on a bridge between them, trying to translate what each was saying, but the bridge was beginning to crumble beneath her feet. The letter went on to explain that Evelyn knew her sons loved each other, but they had drifted apart not for lack of affection, but because they didn't know how to communicate through their differences. Marcus had chosen an artistic, bohemian path that never brought financial stability. Darnell had chosen corporate success, material security, but at the cost of time and personal freedom. Evelyn wrote that neither path was better than the other, just different expressions of who they were as people. But each brother had interpreted the other's choices as an implicit judgment on their own. What Marcus revealed to me next left me speechless. Among the letters, they had found something else, something Evelyn had hidden even from them during her life. Certificates of deposit in the name of both brothers, separate bank accounts she had been quietly funding for years, with modest but consistent amounts. Altogether, she had saved nearly $35,000, split evenly between Marcus and Darnell, money neither of them knew existed. Along with the certificates was a note, written in the shaky handwriting of her final months, that simply said, "So that neither of you has to depend on the other, but can choose to be together." Marcus explained that he and Darnell had made a decision after finding that money. Instead of simply dividing it and putting it away, they had decided to create something with it, something that honored their mother's memory in a more meaningful way. They had established a small but sustainable fund to help families in situations similar to theirs, families dealing with the emotional and financial burden of caring for a parent with dementia while navigating conflicts between siblings. I watched him tell me all this, and I realized that my sentence, as carefully crafted as it had been, was only the beginning. The real change, the true healing, had come from something I could not have ordered: the willingness of 2 wounded brothers to keep choosing each other, conversation after conversation, moment after moment. Marcus then handed me one final document, one that caught me by surprise. It was a formal request to modify the terms of my original sentence. He and Darnell wanted to change the clause dividing future profits from the house. Instead of splitting them between themselves, they wanted everything exceeding the current appraised value to go directly to the fund they had created in their mother's memory. He looked at me with quiet intensity, waiting for my response. I told him I needed time to review the request formally, but that I found their proposal extraordinarily touching. Marcus nodded, stood to leave, but before reaching the door, he turned back. He told me something I will never forget. He said I had given them something more valuable than a fair sentence. I had given them a mirror where they could see not only their mistakes, but also the possibility of redemption. That my decision to force them to look each other in the eyes had been the moment that truly changed everything. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, holding the copies of Evelyn's letters, reflecting on the power and limitations of justice. The Harris case was officially closed 3 months later with the modification Marcus and Darnell had requested. But for me, it never really closed. It became the case I consult when facing difficult decisions, a reminder that sometimes the deepest justice is not found in the perfect application of the law, but in creating space for humanity to flourish. I learned that some wounds can only heal when we stop looking for who is to blame and start looking for how to move forward together. Years after that meeting with Marcus in my office, I continued to receive occasional updates about the fund the brothers had created. They weren't formal communications, just brief emails every 6 months or so, informing me about families they had helped, mediations they had facilitated, resources they had provided to brothers disputing the care of elderly parents. Each message was a silent reminder that my work had an impact that extended far beyond the four walls of my courtroom. What I never told Marcus, what I never shared with anyone until much later, was how much that case had changed me as well. You see, I had built my entire career on the conviction that justice was clear, definable, something that could be achieved through careful application of statutes and precedents. It was a comforting view of the world, orderly and manageable. But the Harris case had revealed cracks in that certainty. It had shown me that sometimes the letter of the law and the spirit of justice were not exactly the same thing, and that navigating that difference required more than legal knowledge. It required empathy, intuition, and the willingness to accept that not all answers were written in books. About 2 years after that last meeting with Marcus, I found myself facing another case that had unsettling echoes of the Harris case. Two sisters fighting over custody of their elderly father, mutual accusations of neglect and exploitation, the same painful pattern of love turned into resentment by stress and despair. As I listened to their testimonies, I clearly saw the path the case was taking, the slippery slope toward a permanent family breakdown. This time, however, I did something different. Instead of waiting until the end to force a moment of human connection, I began to incorporate it into the process itself. After each particularly hard testimony, I paused and asked the sisters to look at each other before continuing. I asked them not just about the disputed facts, but about shared memories, about who their father had been before illness changed him, about what they believed he would have wanted for them. Some of my colleagues thought I was being too soft, too therapeutic for a court of law, but I had learned that sometimes preventing a wound is more important than treating it afterward. The case was resolved in mediation, with the sisters agreeing on a shared custody plan that neither had considered possible at the start. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, something they had built together instead of something imposed on them. When they signed the agreement, I saw in their faces the same exhausted relief I had seen in Marcus and Darnell, that feeling of having found a way back from the edge of an abyss. That was not the last case of that kind I handled. Over the following years, I witnessed dozens of similar family conflicts, each unique in its details, but united by the same underlying themes of love, complicated by impossible circumstances. Each taught me something new about the limits and possibilities of justice, about when to intervene and when to step back, about how to balance authority with compassion. But it was always the Harris case that stayed with me most vividly, the one I revisited on difficult nights when I questioned my own decisions. I kept copies of Evelyn's letters in a drawer of my desk and occasionally reread them when I needed to remember why I had chosen this profession. Those letters captured something essential about family love, how it can be simultaneously the most powerful force in our lives and the most fragile, how it can survive years of silence and distance, but also how it can break under the weight of careless words and unverified assumptions. A few months ago, almost 6 years after issuing my verdict in the Harris case, I received an invitation to speak at a conference on family dispute resolution. I usually decline such invitations because I prefer my work to speak for itself, but this time I accepted. I decided there was a story worth sharing, lessons others might need to hear. During my presentation, I spoke about the Harris case without using real names, respecting their privacy but honoring their story. I described the dilemma I had faced, the conflicting pressures, the moment of forced reconciliation, and what I had learned about the true meaning of justice in family contexts. When I finished, there was a prolonged silence in the room, that kind of silence that indicates people are processing something profound. After the conference, an older man approached me. He had tears in his eyes as he shook my hand. He told me that he and his brother had not spoken in 12 years due to a dispute over their parents' inheritance. He said my story had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that his brother was more important than any amount of money, that the time they had left together was limited and precious. He asked me if I thought it was too late to reach out, to try to repair what had broken. I told him the truth I had learned from the Harris case, that it is never too late as long as both people are alive and willing to try. That reconciliation does not mean pretending the pain never happened, but acknowledging it and choosing to move forward anyway. That sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to take the first step, to reach across the abyss and trust the other will take their hand. I don't know if that man ever contacted his brother, if my story really made any difference in his life, but I hope so, because that is what I have come to believe about justice, That it's not just about sentences and rulings, but about creating moments of possibility, where before there was only despair. It's about reminding people what they have to lose when pride and pain blind them to everything else. The Harris case taught me that the deepest justice is not always found in determining who is right and who is wrong, but in helping people find their way back to each other. It taught me that my true work is not just applying the law, but protecting what really matters, the human connections that hold us all up. And it taught me that sometimes the most important verdict we can offer is not of guilt or innocence, but of hope. The hope that even the most broken relationships can heal if people are willing to do the hard work of truly looking at each other and choosing love over resentment. That is the verdict I continue to pronounce in every case I preside over, in every decision I make, and it is the lesson I will carry with me long after my time on the bench has ended.